Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. It's December, which means last month's poll was a selection of shows that had lost previous polls throughout the year, and the winner of this year's runner-up poll was Metallic Rouge. I remember there being a decent amount of buzz around this show when it came out. It was done as a sort of celebratory project for Studio Bones' 25th anniversary, so it was definitely on my sooner rather than later list anyway. And now that I've seen it, well, some shows I finish and know exactly what the review's gonna look like. Metallic Rouge was one of those anime that I finished and went, okay, where do I even start? Metallic Rouge introduces its audience to a world where humans have colonized Mars, and are already working on terraforming Venus, too. Like most futuristic stories taking place on Mars, we got here after a great war. You'll probably notice a pattern with this anime early on. Everything's always just a little more complicated than it needed to be, so there were actually two alien races. The second is the one we went to war with, but the first was friendly and gave humanity the advanced technology that allowed us to win the war and colonize other planets. Namely, superpowered humanoid androids known as Neons. Metallic Rouge begins in the era of peacetime following the war. Neons aren't designed for battle anymore. These days, they're simple servants, doing whatever their human masters ask of them. And while humanity and Neon kind often live in harmony, there's a more sinister side to all this. Neons are bound by a program called the Asimov Code. If you're familiar with science fiction at all, you're probably already aware of Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. That's basically all it is. In short, it strips them of their free will. It makes them unable to refuse orders they may not agree with, but most importantly, it makes Neons not only unable to harm humans, but also unable to stand by and do nothing in a situation where a human might be harmed. That code compels them to risk their own lives to save humans. I said things are mostly harmonious in this society, but the first episode focuses a lot on the sort of discrimination and abuse Neons can face. Given how many businesses depend on Neon labor, they really carry this society. But despite being perfectly capable of feeling human emotions, no one ever forgets that they're robots. It would be generous to say they're treated like second-class citizens, and this story makes a point of showing you how quickly the humans' goodwill can change, too. In one episode, our main characters are riding a train that gets hijacked. When things are peaceful, one of the other passengers proudly tells them how his Neon is like family, but when things go south and he gets grazed by a bullet, suddenly that family member is nothing but a stupid machine, even though he did do his best to protect the man and the bullet actually shot completely through him. So that's the kind of setting we're working with. Our main character is a young girl named Rouge. Rouge is what's known as a proto-Neon. Not that I'd describe proto-Neons as well-known. Rouge and 9 others were the secret personal project of the professor known for being the leading expert on Neon technology. The proto-Neons are significant and secret for several reasons. For one, unlike regular Neons who have mechanical veins running across their skin, there's nothing visibly different about Rouge. It's not immediately apparent that she's not human, unless you were to see her transform, because 2, proto-Neons have all their combat capabilities. Once transformed, they don a suit of armor and look like more traditional mechs. But lastly, and most importantly, they weren't programmed with the Asimov Code, so they still have their free will and could attack humans if they wanted to. If they want to is the big question early on. The professor's been murdered, supposedly by one of his own creations. When the story opens, Rouge is already 2 assassinations into a mission to track down the other 9 and avenge her pseudo-father, all the while being directed by a mysterious woman named Naomi, whose allegiance and motives aren't totally clear. There are a few different story threads to cover, and a big one is Rouge and Naomi's friendship over the course of the series. I'd say it's the strongest storyline Metallic Rouge offers. I wasn't exactly sold on it at first, and I love a good high-stakes friendship story, so I always go into these types of series wanting to be convinced. They're nothing closer than business partners at the beginning. Rouge was receiving orders remotely. We get to see them meet in person for the first time, and despite their past successes, things are a little rocky at the start. Naomi's an interesting character. I wouldn't be surprised if she's a little polarizing in the fanbase, actually. She's very high energy and fun, a little quirky. The type of character I'd normally find really easy to like. But it's clear from the beginning that she's got her own agenda, and you'd be a fool to trust her. Not to mention, there was something a little off-putting about her interactions with Rouge early on. She treats her less like a partner and more like a subordinate, like a machine. And both of those things are technically true, but it only took a single episode for them to really hammer home that Neons are sentient enough to deserve to be treated with dignity, so it didn't feel right. Another major storyline, predictably, had to do with free will and choosing to follow your own path. And while that aspect of the tale is primarily focused on Rouge, Naomi started to have some development on that side of things too, starting at about the halfway point, once she spent enough time with Rouge that she started seeing her more as a person than a tool. We see Naomi starting to interpret her own orders a little loosely, letting their friendship influence what she thinks is the best way forward, leading up to one big, climax-defining gesture at the end, of course, that I won't spoil. It may sound a little strange, but Naomi's side of things really carried the friendship story for me. Maybe because I didn't fully trust her, or just expected less from her. When the two girls are introduced, we're given one who really does tend to interact with others like a machine at first, and needs to learn how to be a real person who can think for herself. And one who's supposedly already a complete person. I loved seeing them subvert my expectations a bit, and show that Naomi still had room to grow as well. I wanted to talk about her first, because Rouge's growth really has more to do with moving the main story forward. Her mission isn't spelled out for the show's audience nearly as clearly, or early on, as I tried to in this review. Metallic Rouge loves its plot twists and big reveals, maybe a little too much to be honest, so you get everything in pieces. But I didn't think it took too long to get the gist of what was going on. Rouge is tracking down a group of rebellious Neons because they're a danger to humanity. But are they really, though? When we meet her in the first episode, Rouge has gone undercover to work for a famous singer named Sarah Fitzgerald, which turns out to be the alias for Purgatory Viola, one of the proto-Neons. Except Viola wasn't plotting anything sinister. She just wanted to be able to share her love of music with others. Through some brief flashbacks, we see the other two Rouge has already killed also seem to have blended into human society, just trying to live peaceful lives in a manner where they could be treated as equals. Which begs the question, are we actually the villains here? As far as this show's excessive plot twists go, I kind of loved this one. It wasn't hard to believe. Rouge is pretty naive in the beginning. She trusts the people she's working for. It makes her all too easy to manipulate. If only she hadn't been programmed with the ability to think and reason for herself. The absolute highlight of this series for me, I love episode 5. Most of it is spent in this hallucinatory dream sequence Rouge is having, while her mind tries to work through the contradictions between what she's seen and done versus what she's been told. It's just delightfully trippy. I've seen that sort of plot device used before, but I've never seen one that actually felt this much like a dream. You see the same scene play out multiple times, sometimes from a different angle, sometimes including different characters, all the while with a voice that's not quite Rouge's subconscious, prodding at her, asking her whether she's really as free as she thinks she is. On the one hand, it's pretty obvious what's going on and what they're getting at, but they also use this sequence to introduce some new plot points. So there are also some things that'll make no sense to a first-time viewer, because they shouldn't make sense yet, and I loved that it was a little confusing, added really nicely to the overall effect. I think Metallic Rouge got off to a really strong start. Maybe it was never totally original, but I don't usually judge shows too harshly for that, unless it feels like they're really obviously ripping off a specific series. Metallic Rouge did some cool things, and had its fair share of high points. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong all the way through. The big thing Episode 5 introduces is something called Code Eve. It's what the proto-neons are looking for. Basically, its purpose is to disable the Asimov code and free all the regular neons who are being forced to work for humans, likely leading to another war, which is why the human government is so adamant about stopping them. There are several problems with this. I've tried to keep things mostly spoiler-free thus far, and plan to continue on in that vein, but let's start with the story-specific ones. I think this show loses focus a bit. Once Rouge realizes the other proto-neons aren't necessarily the enemy, we start to get to know the remaining ones more as people. Near the end, we just start to spend a lot of time on their interpersonal dramas, and a lot of them just felt like unnecessary distractions. I mentioned that this show loved its plot twists. Maybe a little too much. They just never stopped, and there comes a point where you have to leave all the pieces of your story where they are so you can actually finish your story. And speaking of, I'd say Metallic Rouge's biggest flaw is that it doesn't really have an ending. At least, not the kind that it seemed like they were going for. They have this big final villain reveal that really didn't work. His real goals are never properly explained, and a lot of the twists he tries to shoehorn in at the end wind up being either totally pointless or kind of contradictory. Somewhere along the way, once she got a better grasp of what was going on, Rouge decided that she was going to champion the middle ground. Her end goal is to create a world where humans and neons can both be free and live in harmony together, which also just doesn't really work in the scenario they've set up. The humans are very used to abusing neons without consequence, and I get it. I grew up in the era of triumphant dystopian rebellion stories. My knee-jerk reaction is to side with the oppressed over the oppressors, too. But at the end of the day, the neons are machines, created to do a job. I know it makes me sound like the villain to suggest this, but perhaps the real flaw in this equation was giving them the ability to think and feel like humans in the first place. Maybe the best solution is to just stop producing them that way, or at least the most realistic solution. I know that's kind of a downer to end on, and don't get me wrong, I've seen shows crash and burn way harder than Metallic Rouge, but it's the best I've got to answer for a rushed, lackluster ending that really left all the most important things up in the air still. This might sound weird after all that, but I actually did enjoy quite a bit of this anime. It dropped the ball with its conclusion and the main story, but I think it had some really good micro-stories about free will scattered throughout. Their goals for the world may be a little far-fetched, but Rouge and Naomi both had personal realizations about living their lives by following their own beliefs that I think landed well and were satisfying to watch play out. The very first proto-neon you meet is one of those wild-card, chaos personified, dancing on the edge of insanity type villains. I found him to be pretty obnoxious, honestly, but near the end, as everyone's going on and on talking about freedom, he points out that he's the only one who lives life truly unhindered, not even by his own conscience. He always does whatever will most amuse him in the moment, and while he's totally an example of taking things too far in the other direction, that small moment suddenly made him so thematically relevant that it completely redeemed his character for me. So, no pun intended, but they definitely had the bones of a story that could have worked. If they'd had more than 13 episodes to play with, they may have even been able to pull off a few more of those plot twists. But, though there were definitely things I liked about it, I can't in good faith tell you it was great overall. It fumbled its conclusion just a little too hard. It's not a terrible experience, but it's up to you whether or not you want to give it a chance. Thank you for watching.